Again, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, when the people of Israel were living in their own land, they defiled it by their conduct and their actions. Their conduct was like a woman's monthly uncleanness in my sight. So I poured out my wrath on them because they had shed blood in the land and because they had defiled it with their idols. I dispersed them among the nations, and they were scattered through the countries. I judged them according to their conduct and their actions. And wherever they went among the nations, they profaned my holy name, for it was said of them, "These are the Lord's people," and yet they had to leave his land. I had concern for my holy name, which the people of Israel profaned among the nations where they had gone. Therefore, say to the Israelites, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. It is not for your sake, people of Israel, that I am going to do these things, but for the sake of my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations where you have gone. I will show the holiness of my great name, which has been profaned among the nations, the name you have profaned among them. Then the nations will know that I am the Lord, declares the sovereign Lord, when I am proved holy through you before their eyes. For I will take you out of the nations. I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back into your own land. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. Then you will live in the land I gave your ancestors. You will be my people, and I will be your God. I will save you from all your uncleanness. I will call for the corn and make it plentiful, and I will not bring famine among you. I will increase the fruit of the trees and the crops of the field, so that you will no longer suffer disgrace among the nations because of your famine. Then you will remember your evil ways and wicked deeds, and you will loathe yourselves for your sins and detestable practices. I want you to know that I am not doing this for your sake, declares the sovereign Lord. Be ashamed and disgraced for your conduct, people of Israel. This is what the sovereign Lord says. On the day I cleanse you from all your sins, I will resettle your towns, and the ruins will be rebuilt. The desolate land will be cultivated instead of lying desolate in the sight of all who pass through it. They will say, "This land was laid waste, has become like the Garden of Eden. The cities that were lying in ruins, desolate and destroyed, are now fortified and inhabited." Then the nations around you that remain will know that I, the Lord, have rebuilt what was destroyed and have replanted what was desolate. I, the Lord, have spoken, and I will do it. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Once again, I will yield to Israel's plea and do this for them. I will make their people as numerous as sheep, as numerous as the flocks for offering at Jerusalem during her appointed festivals. So will the ruined cities be filled with the flocks of people. Then they will know that I am the Lord. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Megan. Good evening, everyone. My name's Matt, if we've not met, and I've got the privilege of carrying on our long-running evening series on Ezekiel. Some of you will have been here last week or caught up online, and James took us through Ezekiel 34, so a couple of chapters before this, and it was all about shepherds. We were looking at how the shepherds of Israel had fed themselves and not their sheep, and the flock had scattered. And God's answer to this wasn't to send or train a better set of shepherds, but it was to come himself. He said, "I myself will search for my sheep. I myself will rescue them. I myself will bind up the injured." And today what we're going to see is that same determination, that determination to intervene in the story of Israel and the fate of the world continue and expand as we carry on through this last section of Ezekiel, which is known as the restoration section. And today what we're going to see is the depth of why God is bent on the restoration of this broken, disobedient, exiled people. So turning to today's passage, it is not for your sake, people of Israel, that I am going to do these things, but for the sake of my holy name, God says. If I'm honest with you, I don't really love this. There's something in my millennial psyche that recoils a bit from the idea of someone doing something for the sake of their name, for the sake of their reputation. It doesn't sound to me like a good, pure motivation. It doesn't sound like I want our loving, selfless God to sound. It reeks to me of self-centeredness, of looking out for numero uno, perhaps even of some kind of cover-up and scandal. So I recoil from it a bit. That was how I felt when I kind of got this passage to preach and I read that bit. And I thought, well, I won't really talk about that bit. And then here I am. This is what we're talking about today. What's this all about? Between 1999 and 2015, you might know that more than 900 people who ran our local post offices were prosecuted for theft. And many of them were bankrupted, had their lives torn apart by these prosecutions. Some of them were imprisoned. Many of them were shunned in the communities that they had been central to for years. Some of them died before this was ever brought to light and they were cleared. Some of them took their own lives. And we now know that they had done nothing wrong. There was no theft. There was no money missing. There was a faulty computer system that made it look that way. And what turns a tragedy into a scandal is that we now know that there was at least one moment back in 2013 when the post office were on the verge of looking into this and investigating whether there was something else going on that they needed to do something about. But a public relations executive intervened. And we've seen the email chain where they decided not to look into the emerging evidence that these convictions might be based on faulty information because it would make front page news. They decided to double down on these flawed convictions for the sake of the post office's name. And we know the shape of this in so many other stories and scandals. Hillsborough, Epstein, Pizza Express, Woking. When someone acts to protect their name, in our culture, it feels to me like what normally happens is somebody innocent gets thrown under the bus to make that happen. And so that's the instinct that I kind of read into this text in verse 22 when I hear of God doing something for the sake of his name. That's the kind of stuff that gets conjured up for me. And that's what I worry about. And maybe you do too. That's what I find grating. And so today we're looking into what does it really mean for God to do something for the sake of his name. So this whole passage, starting from verse 16 that Megan read to us, is shaped like a problem and a solution. At the start, we get this verdict of what Israel has done wrong. It's a quick summary of some of the themes that we've been looking at throughout this series in Ezekiel. Their conduct and their actions defiled the land that God had given them. And at the very extremes, they had killed people and they'd worshipped idols. And the consequence of all of this sin and corruption was exile. God casts them out of the land that they had been placed in and that he'd promised them. But this is a problem for God, and this is a problem for his reputation in the world and in front of the watching nations. The nations scoff at a God who can't control his own people. What sort of God is that who has to kick his own people out of their land, who can't control their behavior, who doesn't see obedience coming back from them? So given everything that we know about how reputations get defended, and given every cover-up that we've watched play out, what do we brace ourselves for? Well, I brace myself for Israel to get what's coming to them, for them to be publicly humiliated, their failure exposed, their name destroyed so that God's can be salvaged. Israel knew that they were God's chosen people and his plan for saving creation, and he'd promised to make them great. He'd made this covenant with them. I wonder whether maybe God's going to turn up some small print in the covenant that we'd missed, or maybe demonstrate that actually these people were way worse than he could possibly have imagined. And so we could hardly blame him for actually having to kind of cancel that contract after all. That is how you protect a name. You make sure that all of that failure is clearly someone else's fault. And to some degree, the passage looks like it could start to move in that direction because of how God says he's going to fix things. In verse 23, he says, "I will show the holiness of my great name, which has been profaned among the nations." God is a holy God. And that means that he is set apart. He is distinct. He's other. He is anything but ordinary. The opposite of holy isn't sinful. It's common. It's ordinary. And so one option for a holy God would seem to be to want to have nothing more to do with this common, broken people, to keep his distance from what is dirty, to just make that exile permanent, maybe start again somewhere else. But that's not his solution. And in fact, he says that he's going to do the exact opposite. He will gather them back. He will bring an end to the exile. He will somehow undo the consequence of this gravest sin. In verse 24, he says, "I will take you out of the nations. I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back into your own land." He's not going to exile them further. He's going to bring them home. So how does a holy God move back in with a defiled people without being dragged down to being common himself? What it can't mean is God lowering his standards, shrugging off the sin or turning a blind eye, because that wouldn't be holy. That would be common itself. So how do you gather the unclean into your presence without your presence becoming unclean? His answer is in verse 25. "I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols." Now, this might be bigger than it sounds on the surface of things. In Israel's world, there were some stains that came out, and there were others that weren't. There were different things in their religious life that they had ways of cleaning up. There's ritual impurity, which we sort of start with in verse 17, 18. The kind of mess that comes from things like menstruation, touching dead bodies, the things of just common life and death. And those things aren't bad. That's not what ritual impurity is about. It's about the common things of life and death just needing to be kept separate from the ultimate pure source of life. There's no value judgment. You just wait and you wash and it's sorted. And then there's the stuff that deals with the mess that sins leave behind. And the way that all of that works is that the detergent is blood. The blood, which represents life, lifts the stain of sin out of the temple, the center of Israel's religious life before they are exiled. It lifts the stain of sin out of the temple so that it can be carried away. Because that sin has to go somewhere. It has to be dealt with somehow. And so once a year, the high priest places that lifted sin onto the head of a goat, the scapegoat. And the goat isn't killed for the people's sins, but it's exiled. It's cast out into the wilderness. But Israel's sin had become so great that all of these systems couldn't contain it anymore, which is why they themselves were exiled. They couldn't rely on someone else carrying it away. The exile came to them. But even when this whole system was working, all it was ever doing was maintaining an arrangement that was already a shadow of what God intended. If we think back to Eden, God there is walking in the open with his people. And by the time you get to the temple, his presence is sealed in one room behind a curtain that is accessible to one man on one day of the year. And even then, he has to have a safety line tied around him in case the glory kills him and they have to drag him back out. The glory and the presence of God is under quarantine. And that's not the dream. That's not what we were created for. That's a way of just trying to contain the damage. The system was managing a problem that it could never cure. And into that situation, the unreachable, unwashable, uncurable situation, God says that he will clean the uncleanable. He's going to atone for the unatonable. And he takes the gentlest cleansing that there is, just a sprinkle of water, and he applies it to the deepest stains that the old system couldn't clean up. But the plan goes even further than cleaning up this mess in a way that hadn't been cleaned up before. He goes after the thing that actually makes the mess in the first place. He goes after the source of all this trouble. And in verse 26, he says, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh, and I will put my spirit in you. I think there's a link here back to Genesis 8, the moment right after the flood, when God looks at this world that has been cleansed with water, there's a link there, and says of the human heart that it is bent towards evil from youth. In other words, you can wash the outside of the world, but the problem is going to grow straight back, just as it does, because the problem is in the human heart. It's in each one of us. And so the only real fix isn't another way of washing, but it's to replace that heart with a new heart, which is exactly what God promises that he's going to do here. And it's worth noticing kind of what's wrong with the old heart. It's a different kind of heart. It's a heart of stone. It's not a heart that just needs to be jump-started or needs to have a bit of surgery done on it just to improve it or to make it better. It's a heart that was lifeless, was dead towards God, had no way of responding to him. And so the new heart isn't an upgrade to our moral software, and it's a completely different type of heart. A heart of stone can't renovate itself. You can sand it, you can polish it, you can paint it, but it's still stone. It still has no way of responding to God. You can only be given a new heart, a different kind of heart. And the order, I think, is really important here. If we look at verse 27, he goes on, God says, I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. In that order, the spirit comes first and the obedience comes second. It's the fruit, not the price of entry. You don't need to clean yourself up to qualify for receiving the Spirit. The Spirit is given, and the new life grows out of that gift. And then in verse 31, skipping on, the new heart comes first, and then the people of Israel said to remember their old ways and to feel the weight of them. That grief is real and it's right, but it comes after the grace, not before it. And it's not to earn anything. The grace comes first. This honest sorrow comes second. Some people have a theory and approach to preaching and teaching about the gospel that says that you need to convince people how bad they are and then offer them a solution. That you need to show them that they are sinners and then you can offer them the savior that they need. But that's not the pattern that's happening here or in God's order. He pledges to initiate a relationship, to carry out a restoration, And that results in this repentance. That results in this change. So it's starting to look like this great solution. And then right in the middle of all this restoration, verse 32 repeats that thing that I felt really uncomfortable with at the start. I want you to know that I am not doing this for your sake. Just in case we'd started to feel comfortable about it all. And it still it feels a bit off to me. God has promised all of these consequences. And then he's promised that actually he's going to reverse the consequences and restore Israel. It feels to me a little bit arbitrary. It feels a bit like a parent who threatens a punishment and then doesn't follow through. Who's on a car journey and screams at the kids in the back to settle down, or we're going to turn this car around and we're not going on holiday. And then they don't do it, and then the answer changes to, right, well, fine, we're going on holiday, but it's for my benefit, not for yours. It feels like that kind of arbitrariness. But that's because that's my experience of how people and how reputations and relationships work. And that's what I'm bringing to the text. And so we need to try and peel some of that off and think, what does this mean when God says it? And to do that, I think we need to go back, again, centuries before Ezekiel, back to Genesis, and chapter 15 this time. In chapter 15 of Genesis, God makes a covenant with Abraham. And you might know this scene, but the way that covenants of some sorts were made in the ancient world was that the two parties who were entering into this contract would take a load of animals and they would slaughter them and they would cut the carcasses in half. And they would make this alleyway, this aisle. And both parties would walk down between these carcasses. And it was this representation that said, in effect, if I break this oath, if I break my word, may I end up like these animals. It's a self-curse. It's this pledge that's written in blood that says, if I break this covenant, let me be torn apart. But what happens on the night that God enters into this covenant with Abraham, which is for his descendants, which ultimately is the people of Israel, is that God puts this deep sleep over Abraham. And we see these two images of God, a smoking firepot and a blazing torch. And while Abraham is asleep and just seeing this scene, the two images of God process down between these carcasses. And what that means is that God is taking on the consequence of either party breaking this covenant. He takes the whole oath onto himself, both halves of it, saying that if this covenant is ever broken, even when Abraham or his descendants are the ones that break it, I will bear the cost. He loads all of that onto his name and onto his reputation. The promise that the consequence of a broken covenant would fall on God himself and not on Abraham's descendants was written in from the very beginning. So now what I have to read out of the text when I hear that it's talking about God's holy name are two things. Holy means that lowering the bar was never an option. His name means that throwing Israel under the bus was never going to be an option, because he had loaded all of this onto his name. He had irrevocably bound the fate of the people of Israel to his name. He'd always vowed that he would throw himself under the bus instead. And so that opens up two things to us. The first is simply grace. If God were doing this for Israel's sake, because they'd earned it, because they'd turned a corner, they had a good run, then it would have only ever been as solid as their next good decade or their next good leader. One bad generation and it could all just fall apart again, back to exile. But not for your sake means that it doesn't rest on them at all. It rests on God's commitment to his own name, to this covenant that he'd absorbed all of onto himself. And that doesn't waver. So what that means is that this line that I was worried about when I first read this is actually the line that tells us this is the most secure ground that we will ever stand on. The second thing that it's worth reflecting on is a bit subtler. It's that there is another way that I could conceive of God sort of letting Israel off the hook for this. He could have said that actually they weren't really responsible. Poor things, they didn't know what they were doing. The world is so bad, it was so tough, they just didn't really stand a chance. But think about what that would actually cost them. Again, all the way back in Eden, humans were made for a remarkable vocation, to represent God, to rule the world alongside him as his image bearers. And you can't hold that kind of dignity and not be held to anything. You can't be a real agent, a genuine partner, if your choices don't truly count. To write off Israel as not really responsible would be to demote them out of the very dignity that they were made for. And so God refuses to do that either. He takes their guilt with full seriousness. He takes our guilt with full seriousness as guilt. And then he finds a solution which he committed to falling on himself. He honors them enough to hold them account, and he loves them enough to pay for it. Ezekiel can only take us so far in how this ends up happening. To him, it would have been a mystery. But we get to see exactly what this looks like. If we read on in our Bibles, they're not in chronological order, but if we go through the rest of the kind of history books in the Bible, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, we do see a remnant, a group of people from Israel returning back to the land. And so then we wait for the rest of this. We wait for the new heart that was promised with the end of this exile, for the Spirit to be poured out, for the glory to come back and to fill the temple. And it just doesn't come. They're home, but they're still in every way that matters, living in exile. N.T. Wright makes this point that much of Second Temple Judaism, which is the kind of time between when the stuff in our Bibles in the Old Testament happens and the New Testament, that there was an understanding from people there that the bodies were back in the right postcode, but the rescue hadn't really happened. The exile hadn't actually been brought to the end that they were expecting. Until Jesus. Because Jesus comes announcing essentially that the exile is over. And the way that he does that is by forgiving people's sins. The forgiveness of sins is the opposite of exile. If exile is the punishment for sin, being cast out, then to forgive them is to say that sentence is done, that estrangement can come to an end, that there is a way back in, here and now in Jesus. And the cost, well, this is how God does what he covenanted to right at the start. He carries the cost of this himself in Jesus' death. On the cross, he is driven outside the gate, out into the wilderness of forsakenness, carrying all of this sin to a place that it can never return from. The cost that the whole system was always pushing outward onto something, God finally takes inward into himself. Which brings us all the way back to where we started. How does God vindicate his name without it costing someone innocent? He doesn't. Somebody pays. And here, once that somebody is God. At the cross, he clears his name, and the cost lands not on the powerless and not on us, but on him. He protects his name not at our expense, but at his own. His glory shines the brightest at this precise moment that he takes into himself the bill that we should have paid. And the nations get to see who he really is. And what they see on this Roman cross outside the gate is a God who would sooner be torn apart himself than rebuild his good name on the backs of the guilty. So where does that leave us? What does that mean for us today? If the exile is truly brought to an end in Jesus, then it means that we are the recipients of those new hearts. If the exile finally ends, then the rest of this sequence can happen. The new hearts, the coming of the Spirit, and all that means for the transformation and the restoration of the people. And we live with these new hearts in the context of God's covenant faithfulness. We have these hearts that are no longer bent towards evil, but are bent towards God. So, still, what does that mean? I've been wrestling with this a bit this week to kind of go, sometimes it feels like I get to the big bit of these preachers and kind of go, it's amazing. We've got these new hearts. We're transformed. And then we have to wrestle with the fact that we don't feel like it. We're not at that point where we're perfect, or even sometimes it feels like anywhere close. We're still wrestling with sin and struggling with things. And so what does that mean? Is there something wrong with these hearts that he's given us, or have we still got hearts of stone, or what do we do? How do we go from here? And the penny dropped for me that, well, the good news is, if you feel like that, if you've been a Christian for any length of time and you wonder, what do I do with this fact that I'm told I've got a new heart, but I'm still struggling with this stuff? That is the new heart talking. That's the good news. Because a heart of stone wouldn't respond in that way. A heart that is dead to God wouldn't grasp that, wouldn't long to see that transformation, wouldn't understand that sin. We saw in that order back earlier in the passage that the new heart comes, the Spirit comes, and then the sorrow comes. So if you're sat here and earlier you were bringing to mind things while James led us in that confession that you were feeling that sorrow for, that you felt like you needed to bring before God, that is living with one of these new hearts, a heart of flesh. That is the Spirit dwelling in you, empowering that. Paul tells us in Philippians to be confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. And that confidence comes from the fact that God hasn't given us these hearts for the sake of our names, but for the sake of his. If it was about us, if it was about our names, if it was because we'd earned it, then we could mess it up. But he's done it for the sake of his name, which leaves us secure, as Israel was secure in his covenant faithfulness. He has made a way. That way was Jesus, and so now we get to live out of having those new hearts. We get to just simply respond. And so it's being in this place, being in a community where we can take part in that confession, where we can come and dwell in his presence, where we can build relationships with people who can encourage us and hold us to account. Those are the practical things that we can do to try and be better, new-hearted people, but it all rests on what he has done. And we can be encouraged that any sense of sorrow or longing we have to improve is because those new hearts are already beating inside us.